Lady Eveline Ashford had become the envy of every drawing-room in London. Her marriage to the illustrious Duke of Wycliffe was the fairy tale ending every young woman dreamed of, a union that combined beauty, grace, and unimaginable wealth. Society whispered that she was an angel, descended from heaven itself, blessed beyond measure. But on a frost-laden morning in December, a sealed letter arrived at Wycliffe Manor, bound with black ribbon, and addressed in a hand Eveline had prayed she would never see again. The Duke's fingers trembled as he broke the seal, his eyes darkening with each word. By evening, the angel had fallen from grace, and the fairy tale had shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. If you are listening to this story, do not forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The spring of 1888 brought unseasonable warmth to the heart of London, and with it the promise of a social season more dazzling than any in recent memory. Eveline Ashford stood before the tall windows of her family's townhouse in Belgravia, watching the parade of carriages pass beneath a canopy of flowering cherry trees. At 22 years old, she possessed the kind of beauty that poets struggled to capture in verse. Pale golden hair that caught the light like spun silk, eyes the colour of morning mist over the Thames, and a delicate frame that moved with unconscious grace. Yet behind the porcelain perfection of her features lay a mind sharper than society would ever acknowledge, and a heart that yearned for something more than the predetermined path stretched before her. "Eveline, darling, you mustn't slouch so," her mother, Lady Constance Ashford, called from her position on the settee, where she reviewed guest lists with the intensity of a military general planning a campaign. "The Duke will be calling this afternoon, and you must present yourself as the epitome of refinement." The Duke, Thomas Remington, 9th Duke of Wycliffe, was 35 years old, impossibly wealthy, and possessed of the kind of aristocratic pedigree that made dowagers swoon and debutantes compete with ruthless determination. He had chosen Eveline from among dozens of suitable young women, and the Ashford family had nearly wept with relief. Their fortune, once considerable, had been slowly eroding through her father's unfortunate investments in failed railway ventures. The Duke's interest in their daughter was nothing short of providential salvation. "I am not slouching, Mamma," Eveline replied, though she straightened her posture nonetheless. "I was merely observing the weather. It is remarkably pleasant. The weather is inconsequential. What matters is that you secure the Duke's affection and convince him to formalize his intentions. Your father has already begun preliminary discussions with his solicitors." Lady Constance set down her papers and fixed her daughter with a penetrating stare. "You understand what is at stake, do you not? This marriage is not merely advantageous, it is essential." Eveline understood perfectly. She understood that her worth had been calculated in pounds sterling and social connections. She understood that her opinions on literature, her fascination with the emerging field of archaeology, and her secret ambition to travel beyond the carefully curated world of London society meant nothing in the face of financial necessity. She understood that she was, in essence, a beautifully wrapped package being sold to the highest bidder. "I understand, Mamma," she said quietly, turning away from the window. The Duke arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, as punctual as the bells of Westminster. He was tall and distinguished, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes the colour of slate. His manners were impeccable, his conversation informed and cultured. As he sat in the drawing-room, discussing politics with Eveline's father and complimenting her mother's choice of refreshments, Eveline studied him with the careful attention of someone examining a future she had not chosen. "Lady Eveline," the Duke said, finally turning his attention to her, "I wonder if you might do me the honour of a turn about the garden. The afternoon is so agreeable, and I confess I have particular matters I wish to discuss with you." Her mother's eyes gleamed with barely suppressed triumph. Her father nodded his permission with the gravity of a man watching his debts dissolve before his eyes. Eveline rose, placed her hand in the crook of the Duke's offered arm, and allowed herself to be led into the carefully manicured garden behind the house. "You are very quiet, Lady Eveline," the Duke observed, as they walked beneath a pergola heavy with wisteria. "I hope I have not made you uncomfortable with my request for privacy." "Not at all, Your Grace. I am merely contemplating the beauty of the season." "Yes, the season," he repeated, and something in his tone made her look up at him sharply. "Tell me, Lady Eveline, what are your thoughts on marriage?" It was a bold question, more direct than she had anticipated. She considered her response carefully. "I believe marriage should be a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding." "A diplomatic answer," he said, and she could not tell if he was pleased or disappointed. "But what of love? Do you believe in love, Lady Eveline?" She felt the weight of the question, the way it seemed to test her, to seek some hidden truth beneath the practiced responses every young woman learned to recite. "I believe in the possibility of love, Your Grace. But I also believe that many marriages of our class are built on foundations more pragmatic than romantic." "Pragmatic," he repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, I suppose that is accurate. My first marriage was such an arrangement. The Duchess passed away 3 years ago, and I confess I mourned more the loss of a pleasant companion than a great love." Eveline did not know what to say to this unexpected confession. They walked in silence for several moments, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant song of a thrush. "I find myself drawn to you, Lady Eveline," the Duke continued, his voice measured and controlled. "You possess beauty, certainly, but there is also an intelligence in your eyes that intrigues me. I am seeking a wife, and I believe you would fulfill the role admirably. I can offer you wealth, position, and a life of considerable comfort. In return, I ask for loyalty, discretion, and the performance of the duties expected of a duchess." It was a business proposition, delivered with all the romance of a contract negotiation. Eveline felt something inside her wither, some foolish, girlish hope she had not even known she still harbored. "You honor me with your regard, Your Grace," she said, because that was what she was expected to say. "Then you will consider my suit favorably." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression expectant but not unkind. "I believe my parents would be most pleased by such an alliance," she replied, the careful non-answer of someone who knew she had no real choice in the matter. The Duke smiled, apparently satisfied with her response. "Excellent. I shall speak with your father this evening and make the arrangements formal. We shall announce the engagement at the Devonshire ball next month. It will be quite the event." As they returned to the house, Eveline felt the golden cage closing around her, its bars forged from duty and expectation. She would become the Duchess of Wycliffe, would live in magnificent houses and wear exquisite jewels, would host parties and perform charitable works, and produce heirs to carry on the illustrious Wycliffe name. And she would do it all, with a smile painted on her face and her true self locked away in some forgotten corner of her heart. That evening, after the Duke had departed and her parents had celebrated with champagne and plans for the wedding, Eveline sat alone in her bedroom and allowed herself a single moment of grief for the life she would never live. Then she dried her tears, straightened her shoulders, and began the process of transforming herself into the perfect Duchess. The engagement was indeed announced at the Devonshire ball, in a blaze of champagne and congratulations. Eveline wore white silk and diamonds, and everyone remarked on how radiant she looked, how perfectly suited she was to her elevated position. The Duke stood beside her, accepting the well-wishes of their peers with dignified pleasure. To all the world they appeared the ideal couple. Only Eveline knew that beneath her smile she was already beginning to disappear. The wedding took place on a brilliant June morning at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, attended by nearly 500 guests representing the cream of British aristocracy. Eveline wore a gown of ivory silk overlaid with Brussels lace, a tiara of Wycliffe diamonds crowning her golden hair. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she heard the whispers of admiration, saw the envious glances of other young women, and felt the weight of expectation pressing down upon her like a physical force. The Duke awaited her at the altar, resplendent in his formal attire, his expression composed and satisfied. When she reached his side and placed her trembling hand in his, she made herself a silent promise. She would be the Duchess he required, would play the role with grace and dignity, even if it meant burying her true self so deeply that she might never find it again. The first months of marriage passed in a whirlwind of social obligations. There were country house parties, London entertainments, charity functions, and the endless parade of visitors to Wycliffe Manor, the Duke's magnificent estate in Gloucestershire. Eveline learned quickly that her role was largely ceremonial. She was to look beautiful, speak graciously, manage the household staff with appropriate authority, and otherwise remain a decorative complement to her husband's prominence. The Duke was not unkind. He was courteous, generous with money and gifts, and occasionally sought her company for conversation or to attend the opera. But there was no warmth between them, no genuine connection. Their marriage was exactly what he had promised, a pragmatic arrangement between two people who were polite strangers sharing a name. Winter came early that year, blanketing Wycliffe Manor in frost and snow. Eveline found herself increasingly isolated in the vast house, with only the servants and her own thoughts for company. The Duke had business in London and visited infrequently. When he was present, he spent most of his time in his study or riding the estate grounds, leaving Eveline to occupy herself with embroidery, piano practice, and the carefully curated selection of books deemed appropriate for a lady of her station. It was on a particularly bleak December morning, 6 months after her wedding, that the letter arrived. Eveline was taking breakfast in the small dining room when Pemberton, the butler, entered, carrying the Morning Post on a silver tray. Among the usual invitations and correspondence was a single envelope bound with black ribbon, addressed to His Grace, the Duke of Wycliffe, in a hand that made Eveline's blood run cold. She recognized that handwriting. She would have recognized it anywhere, even after all these years. "Shall I leave this with the rest of His Grace's correspondence, Your Grace?" Pemberton inquired. Eveline's hand shook as she reached for her teacup. "Yes, thank you, Pemberton. That will be all." The butler withdrew, leaving her alone with her suddenly thundering heart. She knew that handwriting. It belonged to Marcus Thornbury, the man who had nearly destroyed her life before it had even properly begun. It had been 5 years ago, when she was just 17. Marcus had been a charming rake, visiting London from his family's estate in Yorkshire. He had swept Eveline off her feet with poetry and promises, secret meetings in Hyde Park, stolen kisses in darkened gardens. She had been young and naive, and utterly convinced that what they shared was true love. Then she had discovered that Marcus was engaged to marry an heiress from Manchester, and that his attentions to Eveline had been nothing more than a cruel game. He had seduced her into believing in a future together, had extracted from her letters full of youthful passion and foolish declarations, had even convinced her to meet him unchaperoned on several occasions. Had anyone discovered their liaison, her reputation would have been destroyed beyond repair. When she confronted him about his engagement, Marcus had laughed. "Did you truly believe I would marry a girl with no fortune and average connections? How delightfully naive! Don't worry, darling. Your secret is safe with me, unless, of course, you make difficulties about our parting." Eveline had been devastated, but also terrified. She had understood the implicit threat. Those letters, those secret meetings, if he chose to expose their connection, she would be ruined. So she had remained silent, had locked away her heartbreak and humiliation, and had prayed she would never hear from Marcus Thornbury again. And now, impossibly, a letter bearing his handwriting had arrived at Wycliffe Manor. The Duke returned from London that afternoon, appearing unannounced in the drawing room, where Eveline was attempting to concentrate on a needlework project. Her hands froze on the canvas when she saw his face. It was ashen, his eyes blazing with an emotion she had never seen in him before. "Your Grace," she began, rising from her chair, "I did not expect you until—" Silence. The word cracked through the air like a whip. The Duke held a letter in his hand, the black ribbon trailing like an accusation. "You will explain this, now." Eveline's mouth went dry. "I do not know what—" "Do not compound your deception with lies," he said, his voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "I have just read a letter from a Mr. Marcus Thornbury. He claims to have been your lover, says he possesses compromising letters you wrote to him, and demands £5,000 in exchange for his silence. He suggests that if I do not comply, he will distribute copies of these letters throughout London society, ensuring that everyone knows the Duchess of Wycliffe is a fraud and a fallen woman." The room seemed to tilt around her. "Your Grace, please, you must allow me to explain." "Explain!" He advanced toward her, his face contorted with betrayal and rage. "What is there to explain? Did you or did you not carry on an illicit relationship with this man? Did you or did you not write him letters?" "I was 17, Eveline whispered, her voice breaking. "He told me he loved me. He promised—" "Promises!" The Duke threw the letter onto a table where it lay like a poisonous serpent. "You came to me a fraud, Lady Eveline. You stood in a church before God and society and allowed me to believe you were pure, virtuous, untouched. Instead, I find I have married a woman with a sordid past and a blackmailer making demands." "I made a mistake," Eveline said, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I was young and foolish. He betrayed me, abandoned me. I thought it was over, buried in the past. I never imagined—" "What you imagined is irrelevant. What matters is that you deceived me. You allowed me to elevate you to a position you do not deserve, to place my family's name and honor in your unworthy hands." The Duke turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with disgust. "I am considering my options, one of which is to have this marriage annulled on the grounds of fraud." Eveline felt the ground disappearing beneath her feet. An annulment would destroy her completely. She would be cast out in public shame, her family ruined by association. She would have nothing, be nothing. "Please," she whispered. "Your Grace, please, I beg you." "Begging is beneath the dignity of a duchess, or at least it should be." He walked toward the door, then paused without turning to look at her. "You will confine yourself to your quarters until I decide what is to be done with you. You will speak to no one about this matter. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Grace." He left without another word, the door closing behind him with terrible finality. Eveline stood alone in the drawing room, her whole world crumbling around her. She had believed herself safe, had thought the past could be buried and forgotten. Instead, it had risen like a ghost to destroy the fragile life she had built. That evening, the household staff began to whisper. By the following morning, the whispers had spread beyond the estate. Within a week, all of London society knew that something scandalous had occurred between the Duke and his new bride. The specific details remained unclear, but the rumors were enough. The perfect Duchess of Wycliffe was not what she seemed. An angel had fallen, and everyone was eager to watch her burn. 3 agonizing weeks passed, during which Eveline lived in a state of suspended exile. The Duke did not visit her chambers, did not send for her, did not acknowledge her existence beyond ensuring she was fed and clothed. She was a ghost haunting her own house, trapped between the life she had lost and an uncertain future she could not control. The servants, once deferential and warm, now regarded her with a mixture of pity and judgment. She heard their whispers in the corridors, saw the meaningful glances exchanged when they thought she was not looking. It was her aunt, Lady Margaret Fairchild, who finally came to her rescue. Margaret was Eveline's late mother's younger sister, a woman who had scandalized society 20 years earlier by refusing multiple proposals of marriage to instead pursue a life of independence and intellectual curiosity. She lived in Bath, where she hosted salons attended by writers, scientists and reformers. She was, in the estimation of polite society, thoroughly eccentric. To Eveline, she had always been a fascinating figure, glimpsed occasionally at family gatherings, a woman who seemed to live by her own rules. Margaret arrived at Wycliffe Manor unannounced on a bitterly cold January morning, sweeping past Pemberton with the authority of someone who recognized no impediment to her will. She found Eveline in the small sitting room, adjacent to her bedroom, pale and hollow-eyed from weeks of isolation and despair. "Good God," Margaret said without preamble. "You look half dead. Pack your things immediately. You are coming with me to Bath." Eveline looked up, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Aunt Margaret? How did you—" "The Duke will never allow—" "The Duke," Margaret interrupted crisply, "has already given his permission. I believe he is quite relieved to have you removed from his household. Apparently your presence is a constant reminder of his poor judgment in wife selection." She softened slightly, crossing to take Eveline's cold hands in her own warm ones. "My dear child, you have been treated abominably. I know what happened. Your mother wrote to me years ago about that wretched Thornbury business, though she swore me to secrecy. I should have intervened then. I shall not fail you again." Tears of relief and gratitude spilled down Eveline's cheeks. "The scandal! Everyone believes I am. Everyone believes exactly what they are inclined to believe, which usually reflects their own prejudices rather than the truth. Let them whisper and speculate. You cannot live your life in terror of gossip." Margaret pulled Eveline to her feet. "Now, summon your maid and prepare to depart. I have a carriage waiting, and I intend to have you installed in my house by nightfall." The journey to Bath took 2 days, and with each mile that passed, Eveline felt some small portion of the terrible weight on her chest begin to lift. Margaret kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling stories of her life in Bath, describing the various interesting characters who frequented her home, carefully avoiding any direct mention of the scandal until Eveline was ready to speak of it. Bath, when they arrived, was a revelation. Margaret's house was a gracious Georgian terrace overlooking the Royal Crescent, filled with books, art, and the lingering scent of exotic tea. There were no rigid social hierarchies here, no servants whispering behind their hands. Margaret's household ran on principles of respect and mutual cooperation that seemed almost revolutionary to Eveline's conditioned expectations. "You will stay here as long as you need," Margaret announced, as she showed Eveline to a bright bedroom decorated in shades of cream and soft blue. "There is no hurry, no pressure. You have been through an ordeal, and you require time to heal." "But the Duke, our marriage—" Eveline's voice faltered. "The Duke is considering his options, which likely means his solicitors are searching for legal grounds to dissolve the marriage without creating an even greater scandal. In the meantime, you are in limbo, which is admittedly uncomfortable, but also presents an unexpected opportunity." "What sort of opportunity?" Eveline asked, bewildered. Margaret smiled, a knowing expression that suggested she saw possibilities invisible to others. "The opportunity to discover who you might become when you are no longer performing for an audience of critics. Come, let me introduce you to some people who will help you remember that you are more than the labels society has tried to pin upon you." That evening, Margaret hosted a small gathering. The guests were unlike anyone Eveline had encountered in London's drawing rooms. There was Professor Edmund Hartwell, a scholar of ancient civilizations who spoke passionately about recent archaeological discoveries in Egypt. There was Dr. Elias Reed, a physician who had established free medical clinics in Bath's poorer districts and who spoke of public health with the fervor of a crusader. There was Mrs. Josephine Crawford, a widow who published a small literary magazine featuring women writers. There was Mr. Philip Ashton, an architect designing modern housing for working families. They welcomed Eveline without prying questions about her circumstances, without judgment in their eyes. They spoke of ideas, of reforms, of discoveries and ambitions. For the first time in her life, Eveline found herself in a conversation that valued her mind rather than her appearance or connections. Dr. Reed, in particular, seemed to take an interest in her perspective. He was perhaps 35, with intelligent dark eyes, unruly brown hair, and the kind of face that reflected genuine compassion. When Eveline hesitantly mentioned her interest in archaeology, a passion she had never dared voice in London, his face lit with enthusiasm. "Have you read Petrie's work on Egyptian pottery sequences?" he asked. "Absolutely fascinating methodology. He is revolutionizing how we understand chronology in the ancient world." "I have read his papers," Eveline admitted, "though I had to obtain them through somewhat irregular channels. They are not generally considered appropriate reading for young ladies." "What utter nonsense," Dr. Reed declared. "Knowledge should never be restricted by such arbitrary prejudices. If you are interested in archaeology, you should pursue that interest. Professor Hartwell is organizing a lecture series at the Bath Literary Society. You should attend." The evening passed in a blur of stimulating conversation and unexpected warmth. When the guests finally departed, Eveline found herself actually smiling for the first time in weeks. "You see," Margaret said, watching her niece's transformed expression, "there is an entire world beyond the narrow confines you have known, a world where you might actually thrive." Over the following weeks, Eveline began to emerge from the shell of despair that had encased her. She attended Professor Hartwell's lectures, absorbing information about ancient civilizations with an appetite she had never been permitted to feed. She volunteered at Dr. Reed's clinics, discovering an unexpected talent for organizing supplies and comforting frightened patients. She attended Mrs. Crawford's literary gatherings, where women discussed books and ideas with passionate intensity, and slowly, tentatively, she began to feel the stirrings of something she had not experienced in months: hope. The Duke had not contacted her. The scandal in London continued to simmer, but here in Bath, among people who valued substance over superficial propriety, she found acceptance. Dr. Reed became a frequent visitor to Margaret's home, ostensibly to discuss medical research with Margaret, who had interests in public health reform, but increasingly seeking out Eveline's company. Their conversations ranged from archaeology to medicine to social reform, and Eveline found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. "You have a remarkable mind, Lady Eveline," Dr. Reed told her one afternoon as they walked through the gardens behind Margaret's house. "It is criminal that you have been discouraged from pursuing intellectual interests." "It is not how women of my class are expected to occupy themselves," Eveline replied, though even as she spoke the words, they felt hollow. The expectations that had governed her entire life were beginning to seem less like immutable laws and more like arbitrary restrictions. "Then perhaps the expectations of your class are fundamentally flawed," Dr. Reed suggested gently. "You are clearly capable of so much more than decorative domesticity." His words, so different from anything her husband had ever expressed, kindled something fierce and determined in her heart. Perhaps she was capable of more. Perhaps this disaster, this public humiliation, might somehow become the beginning of something better rather than simply an ending. Spring came to Bath with a flourish of flowers and renewal. And Eveline, standing in her aunt's garden with sunlight on her face and genuine friendship surrounding her, began to believe that she might yet bloom again. News from London arrived in March, delivered by Margaret's solicitor in a thick envelope bearing official seals. The Duke had decided not to pursue annulment. The legal complications, combined with the potential for even greater scandal, had deterred him. However, he proposed a permanent separation. Eveline would retain her title and receive a generous allowance, but she would live independently from him. She would not be required to return to Wycliffe Manor or to participate in London society as his Duchess. It was, essentially, a civilized exile. Eveline was to be paid to disappear, to become a footnote rather than a scandal. "And what do you think of this arrangement?" Margaret asked, watching her niece's face carefully as she read the documents. Eveline set down the papers, her hands steady. 6 months ago, I would have accepted gratefully, relieved to escape with even this small mercy. But now, she paused, considering, now I find I am angry. I am angry that I am being punished for a youthful indiscretion, while Marcus Thornbury, who orchestrated this blackmail, faces no consequences. I am angry that the Duke presumes to dictate my life, to determine what I deserve and do not deserve. And I am angry that I ever allowed myself to be treated as a commodity rather than a person. Margaret smiled with fierce approval. Good. Anger, properly channeled, can be remarkably clarifying. The question is, what do you intend to do with it? I intend, Eveline said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke it, to stop hiding, to stop allowing others to define me. The Duke wishes me to disappear quietly. Instead, I shall return to London and face society on my own terms. It was a bold decision, perhaps even reckless. Margaret supported it wholeheartedly. You will need allies, she said practically. Fortunately, I know everyone worth knowing and several people who owe me favours. We shall engineer your return carefully. Dr. Reed, when he learned of Eveline's decision, expressed concern. Are you certain this is wise? Society can be extraordinarily cruel. They were walking along the River Avon, the spring sunshine casting dappled patterns on the water. Eveline had grown to treasure these conversations with Dr. Reed, whose respect for her intellect and whose genuine kindness had slowly begun to heal wounds she had thought permanent. I am not certain of anything, Eveline admitted, but I know that I cannot spend my life hiding from my past or from others' judgments. If I am to have any chance at genuine happiness, I must reclaim my story from those who would use it to diminish me. Dr. Reed stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. Lady Eveline, I must tell you something I have been hesitant to express. These past months, getting to know you, witnessing your intelligence and courage and grace, I have come to care for you deeply. I know your circumstances are complicated. I know you are still technically married, and I am merely a physician without title or great fortune. But I want you to know that you have my complete support and my profound admiration. Whatever you decide to do, wherever you choose to go, I shall be honored to stand as your friend and advocate. Eveline felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. You have given me something I did not know I needed, Dr. Reed. You have shown me that kindness and respect between men and women are possible, that I am worthy of both. Whatever happens, I shall treasure that gift. Indeed, the plan for Eveline's return was orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Margaret leveraged her extensive network of connections, calling in favours from influential friends. Professor Hartwell agreed to present a paper on recent archaeological discoveries at a prestigious London symposium, and to request Eveline's assistance as someone who had demonstrated remarkable aptitude for the subject. Mrs. Crawford arranged for several of Eveline's essays on social reform to be published anonymously in respected journals, establishing her intellectual credentials. Dr. Reed secured invitations for Eveline to attend a major medical charity gala, where her volunteer work in Bath's clinics would be publicly acknowledged. They were creating a new narrative, one that positioned Eveline not as a fallen woman, but as a serious-minded individual engaged in meaningful work. It was a risky strategy, but Margaret was confident. Society respects confidence and achievement, she explained. If you enter London apologizing and cowering, they will tear you apart. But if you enter with your head held high, demonstrating value and substance, some of them at least will be forced to reconsider their prejudices. In May, Eveline returned to London. She did not stay at the Ashford family home, where her parents remained mortified by the scandal and had made it clear she was no longer welcome. Instead, she took rooms in a respectable hotel and immediately threw herself into the schedule Margaret had arranged. The first test came at Professor Hartwell's symposium at the Royal Society. The audience was composed largely of scholars and educated gentlemen, with a sprinkling of society figures interested in appearing cultured. When Professor Hartwell introduced Eveline as his research assistant and called upon her to present findings on pottery classification systems, there was a visible ripple of surprise through the room. Eveline stepped to the podium, her heart pounding but her voice steady. She had prepared meticulously, and her genuine passion for the subject shone through her presentation. When she concluded, there was a moment of silence, then spontaneous applause. Several scholars approached afterward to ask detailed questions, treating her as a serious colleague rather than a curiosity. The Duke was not present, but others who knew him were, and word would certainly reach him. The second test came at the Medical Charity Gala, a glittering evening attended by philanthropists and social reformers. Dr. Reed had travelled from Bath specifically to attend, and his presence gave Eveline courage. When Lady Pemberton, the gala's hostess, publicly thanked Eveline for her volunteer work and described her contributions in glowing terms, there were those in the audience who looked surprised, even chagrined, but there were others who looked hostile. Eveline saw Charlotte Blackwood, her former friend, and the Duke's cousin, staring at her with unconcealed malice. Charlotte had been among the first to spread whispers about the scandal, and she clearly resented Eveline's return. The confrontation came during the interval, when Eveline stepped onto a balcony for air. Charlotte followed, her silk gown rustling with agitation. "I cannot believe you have the audacity to show your face in London," Charlotte hissed. "After what you did to Thomas, after the way you deceived him." "I deceived no one," Eveline replied, keeping her voice calm, though her hands trembled. "I was young and foolish and fell prey to a manipulative man." The Duke chose to respond with cruelty rather than understanding. "That was his choice, not my fault." "You are ruined," Charlotte continued, her eyes glittering with spite. "No amount of charity work or intellectual pretension will change that. Society will never accept you." "Perhaps not all of society," Eveline acknowledged. "But I have discovered that the opinions of people like you matter far less than I once believed. There is an entire world beyond the narrow confines of your drawing rooms, Charlotte. A world where character is measured by actions rather than ancient prejudices." Before Charlotte could respond, Dr. Reed appeared on the balcony. "Lady Eveline, they are about to present the awards. Lady Pemberton wishes you to join her on the platform." Eveline swept past Charlotte without another glance, taking Dr. Reed's offered arm. As they walked back into the ballroom, he murmured, "You handled that with remarkable grace." "I am learning," Eveline replied, "that I am stronger than I knew." The evening's culminating moment came when Lady Pemberton announced a new initiative to expand medical services to underserved communities and named Eveline as one of the project's advisors. The applause was genuine, if somewhat tentative from certain quarters. As Eveline stood on that platform, looking out at the assembled guests, she saw a mixture of reactions. Some faces showed approval, even admiration. Others remained skeptical or hostile. But increasingly, she realized that she no longer needed universal approval. She needed only her own integrity and the respect of those whose opinions actually mattered. Near the back of the room, she glimpsed a tall figure standing in shadow, the Duke. He was watching her with an expression she could not fully read. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Eveline held his gaze steadily before deliberately turning away. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stood before him accepting judgment. She was someone new, someone forged in the fire of public humiliation and private despair. And she was discovering that this new version of herself was far more resilient than the perfect Duchess she had once tried to become. Later that evening, as Dr. Reed escorted her back to her hotel, he spoke carefully. "Eveline, I know this is precipitous, and your situation remains complicated, but I must speak honestly. These months in Bath, watching you emerge from despair and claim your own strength, I have fallen in love with you. I know you cannot marry me while you remain the Duke's wife, and I know I cannot offer you the wealth and position you have known, but I can offer you respect, partnership, and genuine affection. When your circumstances allow, if you would consider—" "Yes," Eveline interrupted softly, her hand tightening on his arm. "Yes, Elias. When the time is right, when I am truly free, I would be honored to build a life with you." He stopped walking, turning to face her with wonder in his eyes. "You mean it? I have spent too much of my life living according to others' expectations and dreams. You have shown me what a genuine partnership could be. You value my mind, respect my ambitions, treat me as an equal. That is worth more than all the Duke's wealth and titles." They stood together beneath a street lamp, the spring night soft around them, and for the first time in her life, Eveline felt the stirring of genuine hope for the future. The summer of 1889 brought unexpected developments. Marcus Thornbury, the architect of Eveline's scandal, faced his own reckoning. His blackmail attempts had not ended with Eveline. He had targeted several other individuals with similar schemes, and one victim, a prominent barrister, had finally gone to the authorities rather than pay. Marcus was arrested, charged with extortion, and the subsequent trial became a sensation. During the proceedings, evidence emerged of Marcus's long history of manipulation and deception. Multiple women came forward with stories of betrayal. Letters Marcus had written, boasting to friends about his conquests and schemes, were entered as evidence. The trial laid bare his true character, a calculating predator who had exploited vulnerable young women for amusement and profit. The revelation transformed public perception. Society, which had been so quick to condemn Eveline, suddenly found itself forced to reconsider. She had not been a willing participant in scandal, but rather a victim of a practiced deceiver. The Duke's harsh treatment of her began to appear less like righteous judgment and more like disproportionate cruelty. Margaret showed Eveline the newspaper accounts, watching her niece's face carefully. "How does it feel, knowing the truth is finally public?" "Strange," Eveline admitted. "Part of me wants to feel vindicated, but mostly I feel tired of this entire business. I wish only to move forward." And move forward she did. Her work with the medical charity expanded. She continued assisting Professor Hartwell with archaeological research. She published an essay under her own name, Lady Eveline Reed, having reclaimed her family name, on the necessity of women's education, which was widely discussed and praised. She was building a life of substance and meaning, piece by careful piece. The Duke requested a meeting in July. They met in the drawing room of Margaret's London residence, with Margaret discreetly present as chaperone and support. The Duke looked older than Eveline remembered, his face lined with what might have been regret. "Lady Eveline," he began formally, "I owe you an apology. I responded to Thornbury's accusations with immediate condemnation, without seeking your perspective or considering the context. I have since learned, through the trial and subsequent revelations, that you were victimized rather than culpable. My treatment of you was unjust." Eveline studied him, this man who had once held complete power over her happiness. She felt neither anger nor satisfaction, only a curious detachment. "Thank you for saying so, Your Grace. Though the apology comes somewhat late. I am aware of that." He shifted uncomfortably. "I also understand that you have built a new life for yourself, one that apparently brings you fulfillment. I have been giving considerable thought to our situation. This permanent separation, it benefits neither of us. I cannot remarry while you live, and you cannot pursue your own happiness fully while bound to me." Eveline's heart began to beat faster. "What are you proposing?" "I am willing to petition Parliament for a divorce. It will require an Act of Parliament, as you know, which is complicated and expensive. But I am prepared to undertake the process, and to ensure that the grounds are presented in such a manner as to protect your reputation. I shall claim irreconcilable differences and emphasize my own misjudgment in the marriage." "Why would you do this?" Eveline asked, suspicious of his sudden generosity. The Duke's expression was difficult to read, because I have come to realize that my pride caused both of us considerable suffering. I married you for superficial reasons, treated you as a possession rather than a person, and then cast you aside when your value seemed diminished. That was shameful behavior. I cannot undo the past, but I can remove the legal barriers that prevent you from building a genuine future. Eveline looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. If you are sincere in this offer, Your Grace, I accept. I want nothing from you except freedom. You shall have it, he promised. My solicitors will begin the process immediately. Given the circumstances and my standing in Parliament, I anticipate approval within 6 months to a year. After the Duke departed, Eveline sat in stunned silence. Freedom. The word seemed almost unreal after so many months of being trapped in legal limbo. You will need to be patient, Margaret warned. Parliamentary divorces are complex, but if he is true to his word, you will eventually be free to marry Dr. Reed, should that remain your wish. It is my wish, Eveline said firmly. Elias has shown me what genuine partnership can be. I want to build a life with him, on our own terms. The months that followed were a peculiar mixture of waiting and building. The divorce petition slowly worked its way through Parliament's labyrinthine processes. Meanwhile, Eveline continued her work, increasingly confident in her own abilities and worth. Dr. Reed visited London regularly, and they spent long hours planning their future together. I want to travel, Eveline told him one afternoon as they walked through Hyde Park. I want to see Egypt, Greece, Rome. I want to visit archaeological sites and understand ancient civilizations, not through books alone, but through direct experience. Then we shall travel, Elias promised. My work is not tied to a single location. We can establish free clinics wherever we go, contributing to communities while pursuing your academic interests. We can build a life of purpose and adventure together. It was everything Eveline had never known she could want. Not the gilded cage of aristocratic privilege, but the open horizon of possibility. In December, Eveline received word that the divorce had been granted. She was no longer the Duchess of Wycliffe. She was simply Eveline Ashford again, free to determine her own path. On a cold December evening, exactly 1 year after that terrible letter had arrived at Wycliffe Manor, Elias formally proposed. They were in Margaret's drawing room, surrounded by the books and art that represented a different kind of wealth. He had no grand estate to offer, no ancient title, no fortune beyond his physician's income, but he offered respect, partnership, and genuine love. Eveline Ashford, he said, holding her hands in his, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, not to elevate my status or fulfill some social obligation, but simply because we love each other and want to build a life together? Yes, Eveline answered, tears of joy streaming down her face. Yes, Elias, 1,000 times yes. They married quietly in Bath the following spring, with only Margaret, Professor Hartwell, and a few close friends in attendance. Eveline wore a simple gown of ivory muslin, with wildflowers in her hair instead of diamonds. There was no society audience, no grand spectacle. Just two people making promises they genuinely intended to keep. As they exchanged vows, Eveline reflected on the circuitous journey that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation and heartbreak, the exile and rebuilding, the slow discovery of her own strength, all of it had been necessary to transform her from the frightened girl in the golden cage to the woman who now stood freely choosing her own future. 3 years later, Eveline sat at a small desk in a sunlit room overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Through the open window, she could hear the sounds of the Greek port city of Piraeus, merchants calling to customers, the distant toll of church bells, the cry of gulls wheeling above the harbour. The air carried the scent of salt and time and possibility. She was working on a paper documenting pottery fragments she and Professor Hartwell had recently excavated from a Bronze Age site near Athens. Her research would be published under her own name in a respected archaeological journal. It was work that mattered, work that contributed to human understanding, work that engaged her intellect fully. "Eveline?" Elias appeared in the doorway, his sleeves rolled up and his face flushed from the afternoon sun. He had spent the morning at the free clinic they had established in Piraeus's poorer district, treating patients and training local medical students. "I have remarkable news. The Greek government has agreed to fund expansion of our clinic program to 3 additional cities. They were impressed by the patient outcomes we have documented." Eveline rose and embraced him, sharing his joy. "That's wonderful. Your work is making such a difference here." "Our work," he corrected gently. "You have been essential in organizing the administrative systems and securing funding. This is a partnership, remember? It was indeed a partnership in every sense." They had spent the past 3 years traveling throughout the Mediterranean, combining Elias's medical work with Eveline's archaeological research. They had lived in Egypt, studying ancient temples while establishing health services in rural villages. They had worked in Italy, excavating Roman sites while training local physicians, and now Greece, where ancient history and modern need created perfect opportunities for their unique collaboration. Their life was not easy. Money was sometimes tight, living conditions often Spartan, and the work could be exhausting, but it was genuine. It was meaningful. It was freely chosen. "I received a letter from Aunt Margaret," Eveline said, returning to her desk to retrieve the envelope. "She sends news from London. Apparently, Charlotte Blackwood's husband has left her for an actress, creating quite the scandal. Margaret notes the irony that Charlotte, who was so quick to judge others, now finds herself the subject of society's censure." "Do you feel vindicated?" Elias asked, curious rather than judgmental. Eveline considered the question. "No," she said finally. "I feel only pity. Charlotte built her entire identity on her position in society, on superficial judgments and rigid hierarchies. When those structures fail her, she has nothing genuine beneath. I would not trade my life for hers, scandal or not." "And the Duke?" Elias inquired. "Does Margaret mention him?" "She says he has become increasingly reclusive. He spends most of his time at Wycliffe Manor, avoiding London society. Apparently, he never remarried, despite being free to do so." "Perhaps he learned that wealth and title do not guarantee happiness," Elias suggested. "Perhaps," Eveline agreed, "though I cannot spare much energy worrying about his state of mind. I have my own happiness to attend to." And she was happy, genuinely, deeply happy, in a way she had not imagined possible during those dark months of exile. She was doing work that mattered, with a partner who respected and valued her completely. She was living authentically, according to her own values and ambitions. That evening they hosted dinner for their small community of expatriate scholars and medical workers. Professor Hartwell was present, along with several Greek academics, a French nurse who worked at their clinic, and a young British archaeological student Eveline was mentoring. The conversation ranged from recent excavation discoveries to public health strategies to political developments in Athens. As Eveline listened to the animated discussions, contributing her own insights and laughing at colleagues' jokes, she experienced a moment of profound gratitude. This was the life she had built from the ashes of her earlier disgrace. These were the people she had chosen, who valued her for her mind and character rather than her appearance or connections. Later, as she and Elias walked along the harbour in the gathering twilight, he asked the question that had been hovering between them for months. "Do you ever regret the life you might have had? If things had been different, if there had been no scandal, you might still be the Duchess of Wycliffe, living in luxury and comfort." Eveline stopped walking and turned to face the sea, watching the sun sink toward the horizon in a blaze of gold and crimson. "I regret the pain," she said thoughtfully. "I regret the humiliation and the cruelty, but I do not regret where that path ultimately led me. That life, the life of the perfect Duchess in her golden cage, was slow suffocation. I was disappearing, Elias. I was becoming a beautiful, hollow shell, performing a role I never chose." She turned to face him, taking his hands in hers. "This life, This messy, difficult, exhilarating life of purpose and partnership, this is real. I am fully myself here, in ways I never could have been in that London drawing room. So no, I do not regret leaving that life behind. I only regret that it took such pain to find my way to this one. Elias pulled her close, and they stood together watching the sunset paint the Mediterranean in shades of fire. Behind them, the ancient city of Athens rose against the darkening sky, its marble columns testament to civilizations that had risen and fallen while human hearts continued their eternal quest for meaning and connection. Eveline thought of that frightened girl who had stood in Wycliffe Manor reading a blackmail letter, her world crumbling around her. She wanted to reach back through time and tell that girl what she now knew. That disaster could be the doorway to transformation, that losing everything could teach you what truly mattered, that the path through darkness might lead to light more genuine than anything she had known before. She had believed herself to be a fallen angel, cast from heaven into irredeemable shame. Instead, she had simply been a woman learning to fly with her own wings, choosing her own direction, finding her own way home. Months turned to years. Eveline and Elias continued their work, establishing medical clinics and contributing to archaeological understanding throughout the Mediterranean. They had 2 children, a daughter and a son, whom they raised to value knowledge, compassion, and authentic living over superficial social position. Eveline published numerous scholarly papers and eventually a well-regarded book on Bronze Age pottery. Elias's medical techniques were adopted throughout Greece and beyond. They grew old together, partners in every sense, their love deepening with each shared challenge and triumph. When Eveline was an old woman, a young scholar came to interview her about her archaeological work. At the end of their conversation, the scholar, who clearly knew something of Eveline's history, asked how she had overcome such scandal to build such a remarkable life. Eveline smiled, her eyes still bright despite the lines time had etched around them. "I learned," she said, "that I was never truly fallen. I had simply been caged in other people's expectations. The scandal did not destroy me. It freed me, and once I was free, I discovered I could become whoever I chose to be." If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear which part resonated most with you, and do not forget to tell me from which country you are listening. Your support helps us continue creating these dramatic historical journeys. Thank you for listening, and until the next story.